everyone! You're listening to the Rue Time and Clades. My name is Joan,
And I'm Albert.
and we are back for another nature news episode. We're going to be covering some stories that we were interested in from March of 2023. But before we do that, Albert, how you been?
Ooh, wow. So, yeah, it's been a little while since we recorded an episode together. Of course, you released the dog episode earlier this month. But, yeah, so I guess a number of things have happened. Um, Over here in the UK, we had our Easter holidays. Um, and during that time, I took the chance to fly back to Taiwan to visit my family. It went really well. April is a very good time to visit Taiwan, as it turns out. So I would recommend. It was warmer than it is here in the UK, but not too warm yet. In the summertime, Taiwan can be pretty uncomfortable, being very hot and humid. But in April, it's still very nice, very pleasant temperatures overall. And there were lots of interesting birds and bird behaviors for me to see, as it turns out, because at that point in the year, the wintering birds, most of them still haven't left yet. Whereas some of the migrants are coming in or passing through. It's a time of lots of activity and diversity in terms of the wildlife there. And Taiwan is a very important stopover site for a lot of migratory birds. So, yeah, there are lots of very interesting things to see. And a lot of the species that we're going to be sticking around and breeding were exhibiting courtship behavior. So I got to see some very interesting sights like doves kind of bobbing and cooing to each other, bobbing their heads, that is, if that weren't clear. And I saw kingfishers doing courtship feeding, where the male was feeding the female some fish that he had caught. So yeah, lots of cool bird sightings I had when I went back. And yeah, it was a good time all around. I have been back in the UK now for I think a couple weeks at this point. And so I'm kind of getting back into work, as it were. And so I've been busy with a lot of research projects. Well, okay, not a lot in terms of the number of research projects, but a large amount of work to do in terms of research projects. And so a lot of those are still in progress. Eventually, I'll be able to talk about them more on this show, hopefully. But that day is not today. Um, yeah. So basically, had a good time back home, but I've been keeping busy for most of the while. How about you?
Oh yeah, I mean, I've been keeping up with a lot of things, reading and writing. Had a couple anniversaries with my boyfriend. Um, Doing a lot of yard work outside to help kind of spruce the exterior of the house. So we finally have some of our grass seed growing and putting a lot of ornamental trees and bushes here and there to kind of bring up some color. And in the meantime, having some of my own kind of bird encounters. Uh, oh, let's see. We have killdeers that are nesting in our yard, which is kind of like a second chance for our family
Right.
because back in our old neighborhood, we had killdeers for a good long while, and I became familiar with them. They became my favorite birds, hence my avatar here. And Then there was that one day when one of the nestmates had died in front of our house over the nest, with the other nestmate guarding the body, and it was a kind of a traumatizing experience,
Hmm.
just very out of the blue. But whatever happened, I guess it clued all the other killdeers in the neighborhood to just stop coming through our yard. So all of that ended, and it was kind
Right.
of a huge bummer. And so now that we moved to this new neighborhood, and as we were kind of scoping out, even before the house started construction, we noticed that there was just so many of them here. And so I was kind of fingers crossed. Well, maybe this is our second chance. Maybe
Hmm.
we'll get new killdeers, and they'll nest in our yard, and we can repeat the cycle and have little baby
Hmm.
cotton balls with legs walking around every year. Um, and lo and behold, now that we have one nesting in our yard, if we make sure that the nest is well protected, and we think it is,
Hmm.
it's in a good location, the parent seems healthy, um, that can encourage more of them to come and know that our yard is a safe area for
Yeah.
them.
Hmm.
And oh, it's great. And Let me think. Oh yeah, osprey, really great osprey
Ooh.
encounter. Um, we have a lot of little like man-made ponds here and there that they'll throw fish in for anybody who wants to come and like do some recreational fishing. Um, and I saw an osprey flying over our yard, fish in both talons,
Wow.
good sucker too. And like he came and like perched in a tree for a little bit, and then kind of flew around with the fish back towards the sound. And oh my god, it was so close when it was flying too. So I'm so used to seeing them like out in the distance,
Right.
hovering around, maybe trying to dive the right, catch. So it's always a special day when like I get to see one and I can actually like make it out in a lot
Yeah,
of detail, all the like the feather coloration and stuff. They're very pretty birds,
definitely.
for sure. As well as like the turkey vultures and the bald eagles and
Yeah.
all the different songbirds and this eastern bluebird that we have that I haven't seen it in the last couple of days, but there was a long period of time where it would perch on one of our solar panel lights. So we have like a spotlight in our driveway, so that way at nighttime when we pull in, we have a little bit of extra radiance, and also just in case anybody's coming in to say hi or what have you. And so that's powered by a solar panel attached to the tree. And this bluebird will come and perch on the solar panel, and without extrapolating too much as to the why or what exactly is going on with this bird, it'll like stop and like look at itself and like go to the other side and perch and look at itself and like no hints of like agonistic behaviors or anything like that. It's just sitting there looking at itself, probably because I mean it's got a sharp reflection, that solar panel, and it'll just fly away and then it'll do the same thing several times throughout the day.
Uh-huh.
Um, so like for me, it's like what's going on? And of course my immediate thought is this some sort of like mirror test thing where this bird is seeing something in the mirror? Like, does it recognize what it is? Does it think it's a fellow bluebird trapped somehow in the box and is trying to get it out? I don't know. It's weird behavior, but
Yeah.
it's kind of cool. Um, and so like that was one of my head scratchers among everything else that we've been doing here. And yeah, things have been really, really good, for sure. And of course, just planning ahead for the next couple of episodes to that we want to do for this series. It's been really nice doing the show, and goodness knows, as all these months pass by, there's just so many stories that yeah, it's difficult to pick sometimes because like sometimes it'll be days in a row where just all these stories come out and it's like, oh man, I want to talk about this, but I
Uh-huh.
should probably save it for this episode, or well, this one's more interesting than this. Well, we haven't maybe talked about this subject yet. Maybe we should put that in.
Right.
When we plan for these episodes, we're always trying to um, strike a good balance in content, and thankfully, so far, it seems like it's working fairly well. Um, you all keep coming back and liking our content. Really appreciate that. Um, but yeah, so for this time around for March, we have it's a normal episode. So because it's 1 month, so we have two stories each. But first, we have a couple of announcements that we want to drop in. So if you like, we'll go to the next slide. And
Let's do that.
Albert, why don't you go ahead with this first announcement here?
Oh, sure. So, some of you might recall that we did an episode last year covering essentially a series of websites related to paleontology that have since, for some reason or another, gone offline or stopped updating. We called it our defunct paleontology websites review. I believe that is our longest episode ever. So it's a lot of, there's a lot of material in there. But if you did check it out at all, you may recall that we covered a webcomic from the mid 2000s called Perry and Carney by Mike Kesey. This was a very interesting and darkly humorous webcomic featuring these two characters, although only one of them survives past the first page, basically. um, so one of them is a Parasaurolophus, the other is a Carnotaurus, and that's why the comic is called Perry and Carney. And in it, there was a lot of humor that was based around kind of paleontology, the science of paleontology. So it was a lot of fun for me when I was younger to discover this comic and read through it. In any case, we mentioned back then that eventually the webcomic stopped updating, and the website itself that was hosted on eventually went offline. And so the only way for people who are interested in this comic to reread it again would have been through Wayback Machine, Internet Archive, which fortunately did capture, I think, most, if not all, of the pages. Um, Now, surprisingly, there is some good news related to this webcomic because it turns out that the artist has decided to re-release the entire comic, kind of in a new form. He has basically collected all the old comic strips. A lot of them he also had to go back and download them from Internet Archive because it's so long ago he probably doesn't have the original files anymore. But nonetheless, they are all here, and he has compiled them into this digital volume. As some additional perks, I suppose, this ebook is completely free, so you can download it at no cost, although you are welcome to donate if you feel like it. And he has added a foreword, written quote unquote by Charles Darwin. Of course, this is obviously this is a joke. Foreword is not actually written by Charles Darwin, but adds a bit of humor to the whole thing. And actually, Charles Darwin does appear as an actual character in this webcomic at one point. So it is relevant to the comic. And so yeah, now this comic is essentially no longer defunct in a way, even though it's not updating, it's not getting any new strips drawn anymore. It is now widely available again in a new form, and people can go ahead and check it out. So I hope that you all have as much fun reading it as I did. Fair warning, I know we mentioned this when we did the kind of website reviews, but I mentioned that this comic revolves a lot around dark humor, so there is like bloody gore stuff in there. It's all like very exaggerated and cartoony, but I would not show it to like a little kid or anything like that, even though it's about dinosaurs. So be warned. But anyone else, yeah, I hope you all enjoy it. Do you have anything to add to this?
Well, now I'm just thinking back to all those different comics where the punchline is the gore.
Yeah, very common.
Oh gosh, yeah. I don't want to spoil it for anybody just tuning in, but it's pretty funny for sure. It definitely. I mean, I love comics and I love graphic novels, so I'm always glad to see new ones. And certainly in this case, like to take a piece of media that, for all intents and purposes, is officially gone. Like and kind of bring it back in like in a complete form that's now easily accessible for people again. Like I value that. In an age of lost media, it's kind of nice when a creator is able to go back to his work that's been kind of taken away and not only bring it back, but ensure that it sticks around for a lot longer. Because certainly, like, yeah, people will download the book and they'll probably even print copies for themselves, and it'll have a long shelf life. So I'm very happy to see that. Kudos to you, Mike Kesey. I'm happy to see that this comic is back, sort of, according to the. I just love the title, the cover page of this. This is great. But yeah, that's fantastic. And speaking of paleo, our second announcement. So, Prehistoric Planet, highly anticipated, much beloved, pseudo nature documentary series where prehistoric animals are reconstructed in cutting edge CG, placed in photorealistic backgrounds, and it is presented as if you were watching a nature documentary, a la Planet Earth or Blue Planet or whatever. When this came out last year, it was a huge success. Everybody was talking about it. It was well regarded. The restorations of the animals inside, especially the dinosaurs and pterosaurs, were probably some of the best and most up to date that we had seen by that point. Also helped by the fact that the cast and crew behind the project is probably one of the best that you can get. And so, there was always talk and speculation and hopes and dreams that would not be the last word, and that there would maybe be more seasons or series on the Prehistoric Planet angle that we could look forward to. And so a couple months back, it was announced that, yes, there would be more Prehistoric Planet coming. In fact, we even talked about it ourselves in one of our recent episodes as sort of a heads-up discussion like we're having now. But as of, I believe, Monday of this week, that we are recording, we finally have a trailer
Hmm.
for Prehistoric Planet 2. Um, After much wishing and poking and prodding at the show creators, goodness knows I saw so many tweets. Where's the trailer, Darren Nation? Where's the trailer? But it's here. It's here. Um, and I mean, it looks great. So it's going to get the same treatment as the original Prehistoric Planet. So technically, this is season two. And it seems like this is a lot of material that was made while they were making the original series. And they saved it all for this second season. But they're calling it Prehistoric Planet 2, again, in the new tradition of kind of making follow ups to previous series of the BBC Natural History
Hmm.
Unit. Prehistoric Planet 2 is going to air over 5 days, just like the original, on Apple TV Plus, the streaming service. And that's going to start May 22nd. So in a little less than a month, we'll be able to see this. And it's going to have, 5 episodes, so one new episode per day. And we finally have a little bit more information that we can actually talk about this new season or series. So the 5 episodes have been named. Uh, they're going to do one on islands, one on Badlands. There's going to be a swamp episode, an ocean episode, and then North America gets a whole episode to itself, which is very interesting and kind of strange, I will
Right.
admit.
Yeah.
Um, I am very curious as to the decision making process for that, um, because goodness knows, like, you could have other episodes on the other continents as well, but that doesn't seem to be the case right now.
Hmm.
So there's a little bit of speculation going on about whether this was deliberately planned or not, because of course the series takes place over the stretch of the Maastrichtian age. Nailed it. And So it's one slice of time at the very, very end of the Cretaceous period. And given that the Yucatan Peninsula, which is in North America, is the site of the bolide impact that ended the entire Mesozoic in a blazing day of fire and destruction, it is speculated that that will end the series because it's taking place in a North America episode. Um, Now, I have heard that this is not necessarily fully welcomed by all the paleo community involved because it has become kind of a trope to end a dinosaur documentary series, especially one that covers a lot of material, to just kind of end your series with the mass extinction event. Um, and so, like, there's a lot of feelings that it's kind of been done to death. Uh, and Given what the show producer John Favreau and crew have talked about, there wasn't really any interest in depicting that to begin with, perhaps. So we don't know. We don't know, like, what the goal is that with the ending of the series, how it's going to be,
Hmm.
um, because, like, with the first run of Prehistoric Planet, before we knew that there would be more, it kind of ended on a very subtle and nice note.
Hmm.
This majestic as dark a pterosaur flying off into the sunset, um, and like, that was kind of nice for a change. Like, you don't have to depict your animals always in the context of, oh, they're going to be gone soon.
Right.
It's it's kind of nice for a change. But regardless, we do know that we're going to have many sequences featuring new animals, including Tarchia, an ankylosaur from Asia, as well as Pachycephalosaurs, which will be their first appearance in this series, as well as a lot of returning favorites. I understand we're going to get a standoff between a Tyrannosaurus and a Quetzalcoatlus,
Hmm.
which is kind of exciting. I don't know about you, but it kind of gave me echoes of when dinosaurs roamed America.
Hmm. Yeah.
If you remember that series,
Yep.
because they had a sequence kind of like that, although it was a little bit more anticlimactic. I doubt that they're going to have like a WWE brawl in this series, but
Right.
it's
Right.
kind of it will certainly bring home the point to viewers that you know being in the same environment as one of these things is probably would probably be terrifying. Uh, a so-called murder stork that's
Mm.
as tall as a giraffe. It's like, no, thank you. Like even if you're a Tyrannosaurus, you probably wouldn't. You probably want to give that a wide berth.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, May 22nd, Apple TV Plus, Prehistoric Planet 2. It looks great. The trailer's awesome. We will definitely be posting the link to that, as well as the link to the Perry and Carney comic for those
Mm.
who want to pay or donate.
Yep. Mm.
Um, but Albert, do you have any additional thoughts on PP2?
Not too much at this point, but obviously I'm super excited for it. Everything looks great. And I am quite excited to see that in this particular trailer, there are several shots showing animals that seem to be birds or close bird relatives that we did not get much representation of in the previous series. One of my few kind of grievances with it. So I'm very, very excited to see how they're going to be portrayed. And yeah, I also think that the kind of theming of the episodes can be a bit odd in places. The North America one really stands out like a sore thumb. And I would say, like, even in the first series, there were some episodes that did not feel like they stuck to the theme as tightly as perhaps the kind of structure would imply. Like the the obvious example there was the freshwater episode in the first season, which is like, okay, well, yeah, technically all of the segments took place in a freshwater environment, but it didn't seem like it was really about freshwater ecosystems as such.
Mm.
It does make me wonder, like exactly how these segments were all like structured and organized from the beginning, because in some cases it really feels like they kind of maybe decided on the theming after the fact. But you know, that's all speculation on my part, and I think regardless of how they're organized, I'm sure this new series is going to be excellent, and I suspect it'll be. I'll enjoy it at least as much as I did the first one. So I'm definitely looking forward to it.
Oh yeah, definitely to echo on what you were talking about with like seeing actual like birds like on screen,
Mm-hmm.
like that are more than just a background role. Yeah, I definitely hope that we will see more smaller, less charismatic animals
Mm-hmm.
um, kind of get their time in the limelight. I know a big critique, and I say big critique, like the series was well regarded, but like one of the main things that I saw people comment on was the lack of like crocodilomorphs.
Yeah.
Um, and so considering that they have a whole sequence with Madagascar in the first series, and then apparently again here with Beelzebufo, the giant
Yeah.
frog, um, it'd be a perfect opportunity to showcase some of the Madagascan species at least,
Mm-hmm.
because they're weird and wonderful and fairly obscure, and they could certainly benefit from some time in the limelight. Because goodness knows, non-specialists watch this stuff too. Um, I was pleasantly pleased to see YMS Adam, the movie reviewer from Your Movie Sucks, who did the Kimba and Lion King 2019 reviews. If you know your internet people, you probably know him.
Mm-hmm.
But he did a whole like watch through for his fans on stream of Prehistoric Planet. Partly because he had been doing the Lion King 2019 review, so he needed to kind of brush up on his Jon Favreau
Mm-hmm.
filmography. But also because he's a huge fan of the BBC Natural History series. Like he's watched all of them. He regards them all fairly well. And so like that was kind of a fun surprise. Like, oh hey, this YouTuber review guy that I watch who does like funny haha videos, like he's actually like big into all this same stuff that I'm into. So it's kind of it was kind of funny to see him like go through Prehistoric Planet
Yeah.
and like make his usual jokes and things. Like he a common joke that he made where even he knew, like he understood fairly well like what the point of the series was, but he kept making jokes like, how do they know that? you know? Like that's a very specific behavior. But it was kind of fun. But again, it just goes to show that like you know this series is reaching a wide audience and kind of showing them all really fascinating new behaviors that are not new to us in the paleontological world.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's incredibly exciting to see. It's definitely looking forward to it for sure. Um, but hey, if there's anything else we have to add, we can go ahead and jump into our news stories.
Sounds good.
Um, I believe I have the first go. Um,
Yep.
yes, that's right. Okay. So, my first story combines two subjects that are probably among the most fascinating in biology. That is eusocial insects, so those forms like ants and bees and termites who live in such closely knit cooperative societies that millions of individuals function like one organism, and social learning, when one organism learns a behavior or piece of information by closely observing or interacting with another organism or a group of organisms. So humans, of course, straddle tightrope between these subjects. While it has been proposed in the past that humans are eusocial organisms, that proposal has fallen by the wayside. Um, we, for example, do not have a reproduction-based division of labor where everyone else in the community loses their ability to give birth, with the exception of like one really big queen. Um, wouldn't that be funny? But like we do often congregate in large groups and work together to perform tasks that could be considered something that a single organism would do. And it goes without saying that humans are masters of social learning. We have extended that concept to collective learning, where an individual can learn from those long since past, and then take that information and build up on it to create new forms of knowledge. So the fact that eusocial insects engage in social learning is not in dispute, but there is a large question about whether their ability to communicate with each other is in any way shaped by social learning. In other words, can social learning actually improve the ability of eusocial insects to communicate information so that said info is more accurate and helpful to the group as a whole? And so, one aspect of social learning concerns the so called waggle dance, you heard that right, of the honeybee, that is Apis mellifera and related forms, which was first recorded in the literature by a German Austrian ethologist, so an animal behavior scientist, Carl von Frisch. And this was way back in 1927. And so I think it's only fair that we allow Mr. Frisch to explain what this waggle dance is, using his own words from a 1974 publication. So let me pull that up here. The forager bee, having returned to the hive and disposed of its burden, begins a kind of round dance. It runs in tight circles, with rapid tripping steps, on whatever part of the comb it happens to be, often changing so that it runs now clockwise, now counterclockwise, alternating after one or two circuits in each direction. This dance is performed in the middle of a dense crowd of nestmates. It is particularly striking and charming to watch because it visibly affects the surrounding bees. Those closest to the dancing bee trip along behind it, trying to keep their outstretched antennae in contact with its abdomen and follow all its twists and turns, so that the dancer is trailed through its contortions by a long tail, as it seems, of other bees. This chaotic pattern can be maintained for a few seconds, half a minute, or even a whole minute. Then the dancer suddenly stops and withdraws from its retinue, only, in many cases, to go to a second and even a third place on the comb. Each time it regurgitates a droplet of honey and performs another dance. Finally, though, the dancer rushes precipitously back to the flight hole and flies once again to the food site to bring in a fresh load. The whole performance is repeated each time it returns. Under normal circumstances, of course, the dance is done in the pitch darkness of a closed beehive, so that the dancer is invisible to its comrades. When they notice its activity and follow it through its tortuous course, they're relying entirely on their senses of touch and smell. End quote. A visualization of this dance can be seen in section A of this figure here on the slide. The movements of the honeybee provide concise and specific instructions as to the direction, distance, and quality of a given resource. So the angle of the waggle dance corresponds to the direction, and the longer the waggle dance, the farther away the distance is. Surprisingly, in the dark of the hive, the bee actually gives the position of the sun as a means to help the nestmates align themselves with the appropriate vertical position of the resource. And in terms of the overall quality of said resource, like how much of it there is, that is given by the number of repetitive waggling and the speed of the dance sequences in the dance. So if a bee is repeating the dance a bunch of times, then that means that there's a bunch of food somewhere. Now, as with many animal behaviors, there is a genetic component to the waggle dance. Among the Eurasian honeybee we're focusing on today, as well as in the other honeybee species in the genus Apis, the ability to communicate distance in the waggle dance has been found to be genetically encoded. But so far, this is the only DNA based part of the waggle dance that researchers have been able to recover. Um, so far as we can tell, the rest of the waggle dance is socially learned. But again, herein lies the question. Do the bees improve their ability to perform the waggle dance and convey accurate information through the learning of the dance? So even when they're young and have never done the dance before, does that still apply? And this is where Xiahao Dong and colleagues come in with this paper that I'm talking about today. They proposed that young honeybees performing their very first waggle dance will get it more wrong if they haven't had the opportunity to watch more experienced bees doing the dance. And in such a crowded hive full of jiggling, buzzing bees, that seems like a reasonable hypothesis. So the team set up their own hives and colonies, five in all, and marked their bees based on experience in the waggle dance. So they selected day old bees as the test subjects and then observed them as they aged until it was the time to learn their own waggle dance. And conveniently, this only seemed to occur within the first day or two of the colony's creation that these bees were beginning this process. And then they waited 20 days later to see if they made any improvements. And indeed, it turned out that the ability to observe a waggle dance did improve the communication skills of the younger bees and greatly affect the clarity and correctness of the information. So since the waggle dance is performed in the darkness of a hive, the key to really gaining the necessary skills was for the younger bees to touch the performing experienced bees with their antennae. And if the bees failed to be tutored in this way, then their results proved far less valuable and incorrect. The divergence of angles in the dance increases, the duration of the dance becomes much too longer or shorter than necessary, the ability to gauge quality lessens, and the quality of the dance itself overall becomes inadequate. Now, crucially, it was shown that out of all the younger bees, there was actually a critical learning phase among the new bees when they were only roughly 8 days old. That's the period when the younger bees are just about to become foragers and contribute to the good of the colony. So it's obviously important that they should learn the waggle dance then rather than later. And so when the next time foraging comes, those younger novice bees now have the necessary skills to do their own dances. And as the authors observed, the dances improved in their accuracy and communication skills. Now, in fairness to the less experienced bees who failed to learn their first waggle dance, even they were observed to have made some improvements in terms of giving location, but it was never to the level of the bees who got the chance to actually learn up close. In stark contrast to a species like us, who could never stop learning, no matter what age, these mistakes became encoded in the bees' dances for the rest of their short lives. And so such results add to a growing body of knowledge regarding social learning in eusocial insects. Northern paper wasps, so Polistes fuscatus, they learn facial recognition through the observance of nest conflicts so that they know how to treat different individuals. And in fact, regarding research in 2020 by Sarah Miller and colleagues, this learning process only emerged from a series of selective sweeps in the genome within the last 8,000 years. So that's a very recent development. And this ability to read faces has been documented in other wasp species. And for some, this can even cross species. So it has been shown that the golden paper wasp, so Polistes aurifer, can learn to recognize human faces and even distinguish between good and bad people. And elsewhere in the Hymenoptera clade, bumblebees of the genus Bombus, they learn about proper foraging sources and techniques through learning which choices created rewards or troubles for others. And they can even improve their foraging behaviors to get better rewards after watching another bee get rewarded, which effectively makes bumblebees starved for overachievement. And even last month, there was a paper by Alice Bridges and colleagues that tested the ability of bumblebees to open boxes for rewards and found evidence that they could acquire new strategies in doing so from their peers, which is kind of fun. Among the ants, it has been shown that the younger individuals who run in tandem along a path with experienced foragers can learn how to forage more effectively and thus spread this knowledge throughout the colony. Now, in regards to the honeybees themselves, there are certainly more paths for research into social learning. There's a companion article to this paper where the team speculated that honeybees may be sharing information about proper hygiene against parasites. The varroa mite causes great harm in honeybees, and so that would certainly help. As well as like speculations about whether the bees' observations of environmental changes can be transmitted socially through the waggle dance over time. And there's even a possibility, which would have great implications, I feel, for our understanding of insect evolution, that through social learning, including the fact that inexperienced bees retain a poor waggle dance their entire lives, honeybees might be influencing their behaviors over time through cultural modification. And if you think about it, insects having culture, that's a fascinating idea. But then again, all the great strides in biology that have been made over the years, it's certainly something that we should look into. So I definitely thought that this was a fascinating paper. Yeah, again, like eusocial insects are one of the marvels of evolution. I never failed to be impressed by like their abilities to work together so fluently to create anything from like great nest structures to like learning how to farm, learning how to like make the architecture of their nests so that airflow goes in just the right way to push the bad stale air out and put clean air in. Like it's insane. It's amazing. What do you think, Albert?
Yeah, I mean, fascinating, I think, is a good word for it. I think it is remarkable that we are still making huge discoveries about this behavior at this point because the waggle dance is an incredibly well known behavior in a species that is incredibly well known to humans. I mean, honeybees are practically a domesticated species. Lots of people keep them and have, like, extensive experience observing them and looking after them. And yeah, in fact, I suspect that one of the earliest things I learned about honeybee behavior was the fact that they performed this waggle dance. And when I say that it's well known, I don't mean just to people like us who are like really into zoology and things, but I mean, I think even in like general pop culture, there is a presence of the waggle dance there. What comes to mind is the Disney cartoon Phineas and Ferb. One of my favorite shows. There is one episode where they actually talk about the waggle dance and even sing an entire song about it. So that the plot of that episode had to do with bees, and so that's a show that it takes some inspiration from natural phenomena and science, but it's not primarily an educational show, and yet they decide to highlight this very interesting behavior. So it's a pretty widely known phenomenon, I would say, among the general public. The fact that we are still discovering like such an important component to it is pretty incredible, and of course the finding itself is really interesting too. Definitely, even though the fact that eusocial insects have social learning is not disputed scientifically anymore. I feel like it's probably still something that's pretty surprising to a lot of people. Yeah, like insects learn from other individuals, like in in some ways, much like we can. Um, it certainly raises interesting questions about, what does it mean to be intelligent and so on. Like, are there different types of intelligence? And those are definitely like questions that could be explored a lot. We've certainly talked a little bit about when it comes to bird cognition. Um, so yes, I'm definitely with you.
Oh yeah, and like just one more thing before we move on. One thing about like the waggle dance itself that I think really stuck to me in recent years was when I was watching an episode of the Cosmos Possible
Oh
Worlds
yeah.
series. So this was the new run that they did with Fox and Nat Geo, where they kind of continued the legacy of Carl Sagan in making that series. Um, and in an interesting framing device, they dedicated an entire episode to bees
Hmm.
and bee evolution, and they highlighted the waggle dance as an example of humans learning the language of another species.
Ah.
Now, I guess to call the waggle dance a language might be stretching it a bit
Hmm.
much. Of course, you would have to redefine like what a language is. Um, but I think it's fitting in like in a sort of poetry of science kind of way. The fact that an animal is wildly different from a human as a honeybee in a lot of respects. Like we've been able to look at this curious little wiggling motion of these bees that for most of history we probably never even really paid attention to. Um, and like not only like figure out the steps of the dance, but also like translate what the steps mean and how like the differences in like length or dimension of the dance can correspond to geographical location and quality of a resource.
Hmm.
Like that's remarkable that we've been able to do that. And of course, in the episode itself, they kind of frame it as a sort of what if scenario, like humans coming into contact with an intelligent species from another world. You know, it's technically kind of happened before in a sense.
Right. Right.
Like, I mean, like yeah, sure, sure. Like it's kind of silly to think about, but again, at the same time, it's like it's just one of those remarkable things that people have been able to do, where they've translated a behavior from another organism near accurately. And even so, like with studies like this, like there's nuances to that we're still just now finding out. Um, it's inspirational, I think.
For sure.
I think like for anybody who's interested in like the scientific method and learning about a world that is knowable, that you can get so far with something like this. Um, it's incredible for sure.
Hmm.
Um, but that's definitely all I have to say on this paper. Albert, if you like, we can jump on over to your first story.
Sounds good. Um, so the first story I picked is about these very unusual birds called woodcocks. Yeah, I picked a bird story as one of my stories, kind of getting predictable at this point. But yeah, this is a pretty interesting study about I think very interesting birds. So what are woodcocks anyway? Um, well, woodcocks are a genus of sandpipers of all things, so they are in the genus Scolopax. Um, and what makes them very unusual, well, there are many things that make them unusual, but one of the first things that set them apart from most other sandpipers is that whereas you might imagine most other sandpipers kind of spending most of their time on, say, beaches or in marshes, places near bodies of water, um, woodcocks prefer to live deep in forests. And usually these are moist forests because of the types of things they like to eat, which I'll get to shortly. But still, they're not directly tied to water in the way that a lot of other sandpipers are. And yet they are indeed sandpipers. And in fact, the entire group that unites all the sandpipers together is named after the woodcocks. So the sandpiper clade is Scolopacidae, which is named after the woodcock genus Scolopax. So they are, honest to goodness, sandpipers. Um, Now, in addition to their habitat, woodcocks have a number of other features that don't that not only make them weird for sandpipers, but make them weird among birds in general. Um, so, first of all, is that woodcocks spend a lot of their time uh, probing for food in the forest soil, and they especially like to eat earthworms. And so, to do this, like other sandpipers, they have a very long bill that they can, kind of probe deep into substrate. But since they don't do this, out in the open, like a lot of other sandpipers do, they have to be kind of on the constant lookout for danger that might be coming, or at least they need specific adaptations that can help them do that more effectively. Because they can't see something coming from a long way off. To do this, they have a very unusual kind of shape of their skull that kind of positions their eyes very close to the top and the back of their heads. So their eyes are set very high on the head. And so what this means is that a woodcock can, spend all its time kind of with its bill pointing down and poking at the ground with it, and still it is able to get an essentially panoramic view of its surroundings, like all around its head because of its eyes being sitting right up there on the top of its skull. To facilitate this adaptation, because the eyes have moved back, this also means that the ears of the woodcock have actually moved forward. So now the openings for the ears are positioned directly underneath their eyes. So the entire skull is kind of warped in this kind of very weird way. Definitely one of the strangest bird skulls out there. Now, with the eyes positioned on top of the head, they can see all around them, but this means that they can't see the tip of their own bills, which is an interesting paradox. But this is no problem for the woodcocks because woodcocks have very sensitive bills. They have a very specialized sense of touch in the bill tip that allows them to be able to detect food hidden in the soil without actually having to see it for themselves. And in fact, they are one of the groups of birds that have this specialized sensory organ in the bill, and some other sandpipers have this too. And basically, what they can do is that they don't even have to touch the actual object that they're looking for in the soil. To be able to detect it, because what they can do is they can also detect vibrations of prey moving underground using the bill, and furthermore, they can also detect essentially kind of pressure changes caused by their own probing in the soil. So it's in a way it's like echolocation, I guess you can think of it, but by touch. So the probing action of their bill kind of disturbs the substrate in a way that allows them to kind of detect what the surrounding like substrate is like at the location where they just probed. So that's quite incredible. There's a postdoc currently in my supervisor's lab right now, Carla Dutoy, who's specializes in studying the kind of probing senses of birds. So primarily she's worked on ibises, which are another group of birds that have a similar ability, but it is also found in some of these sandpipers as well. And like some of the other sandpipers, woodcocks have a very flexible bill, so it can not only open and close at the kind of at the location of the jaw joint. Like the upper jaw of the woodcock can also bend along its length. So basically, in the middle part of the bill, it can actually flip the bill upward, and in doing so, that means it can basically grab a worm in the soil without having to open its mouth all the way from the base, and thus, even in a very narrow space, it is still able to grab its prey. Now, woodcocks are nocturnal, so they're very secretive, and most of the time you are not likely to see them. There are 8 different species of woodcock. One of them lives across much of Eurasia, and that's a Eurasian woodcock, which is the subject of the study at present. And there's also a species in North America called the American woodcock, which is found across much of the eastern part of North America. And the remaining woodcock species are mostly restricted to kind of to individual islands. So they have a much more restricted distribution. But in any case, woodcocks are pretty hard to observe because not only are they nocturnal, but they also have kind of these very relatively drab and kind of intricate brown coloration. that gives them very, very good camouflage. So pretty much the most likely way you are to see a woodcock is to either scare one while you're walking around in the woods. So maybe one is kind of resting nearby, and then you just happen to scare it, you scare it into flight. Or during the mating displays that the males give in the springtime. So the Eurasian woodcock will, during the breeding season, and this usually happens at dawn and dusk, primarily dusk, the males will actually fly into the air and kind of fly back and forth over the trees as part of their mating display. And they do this only for a very short window of time every day. Until they attract females to breed with. And the American woodcock does this quite spectacular display where the male starts out by calling. They make this kind of call that's been called a peent call, because that's kind of what it sounds like, a peent. It does these calls on the ground, and so you can sometimes locate them that way. But after a bit of calling, they'll fly up into the air in this kind of spiral pattern. And as they do so, they also make a noise that seems to be created by the flapping of their wings, or the air rushing through their wing feathers, essentially. And so those are some of the few times that woodcocks are actually showy, and one of the few opportunities you might have to actually see one. Otherwise, they are very, very difficult to detect. Basically, this new study, in a way, kind of makes woodcocks even more unusual, because the researchers, the authors of this study, decide to look at something quite interesting. Because I said, overall, woodcocks have a color pattern that makes them very well camouflaged, and yet underneath their tail, the undersides of their tail feathers, as you can see in this photo, they have these very bright white tips of the feathers down there. Now, most of the time, you won't be able to see these out in the field, but when a woodcock takes flight, they are visible, or when a woodcock decides to flip its tail over while it's standing on the ground, it becomes visible. And these white patches are very, very bright, and so the authors of this paper decide to investigate how do they make these really bright white feathers, and how bright are they exactly. And so they studied the Eurasian woodcock species, and not only looked at the structure of the feather, but also kind of tried to measure how much light these white feather tips can actually reflect. And what they found was that the diffuse reflectance of woodcock feather tips is the highest recorded of any white feather. And what does that mean? Well, diffuse reflectance basically means that the light that is scattered by being reflected off these structures. So if you think of your typical mirror, the light basically is reflected all in one direction. But the feathers in these woodcocks, these tail feather tips, they are adapted to kind of scatter the reflected light in all these different directions. And the diffuse reflectance, so the scattered reflectance of the light, is higher than any other white feather that anyone has ever recorded, 30% higher than the next brightest people have measured. So, in other words, woodcocks produce the most brilliantly white plumage in birds, at least in terms of diffuse reflectance. Now, just as a kind of point of note, the second highest diffuse reflectance that has been measured in a white feather is found in the Caspian tern, which is a species that we have talked about before on the show. I think in one of our news episodes last year, we talked about how these terns learn how to migrate from their male parents. So that's a pretty interesting study that we did. That wasn't about coloration, but it is interesting that we have talked about that species. But in any case, back to the woodcocks. How do they produce this brilliant white reflectance anyways? It turns out that the tips of these woodcock feathers, and these are restricted to the tips and not to the rest of the tail feather, the barbs of these feathers, so what are those? Well, if you think about a typical feather structure, a typical wing or tail feather of bird is composed of the central shaft, and then off the shaft, you have a lot of little branches kind of coming off either side of it. And the main branches that come off are called barbs. And then on each of those barbs, there are also smaller branches that come off of those, which are called barbules. And on each of those barbules, there are even smaller branches that come off of them and hook the entire feather structure together. So they're called hooklets. But in any case, the important part here are the barbs, the main branches coming off the feather. At the tip of the woodcock tail feathers, the barbs are wide and flattened and they overlap each other. So you can think of those window blinds that are composed of these panels that overlap each other when they're closed. The feather structure, or the structure of the feathers in the woodcocks, are a lot like those window blinds where the barbs are overlapping each other. And so this means that with this overlapping structure, they can reflect more light, meaning less light can pass through them than they otherwise would be able to. Furthermore, inside the barbs, there's a very complex, kind of spongy network of keratin and air spaces, which means that when light does pass through these feathers, they kind of have to bounce around the internal structure for a bit. And in doing so, a lot of that light gets reflected back out again. So these feathers are incredibly effective at scattering light. And again, these unusual features are not found in the rest of the tail feather. It's only restricted to these white tips. So very, very cool. But why do woodcocks have these bright white patches anyway? This is not fully understood, and it will probably take some field studies to understand exactly how these white feather patches are used. But almost certainly they are used as some kind of signal. And in fact, a lot of nocturnal birds that have visual signals use white color patches for this purpose, because pretty much any other kind of color you're not likely to see at night, right? Pretty much any other kind of color is going to look dark at night. But if you have white feathers, then that might just be able to reflect a little bit of the starlight and the moonlight, just enough for you to kind of get your signal off if you need to. And so probably the white coloration in woodcocks is also used in some kind of visual display, even if we don't fully understand what that is yet. Kind of one final thing about woodcocks that is not directly related to the study but is worth mentioning is another kind of very unusual behavior that they have. And people have made this into memes. So they have a very unusual way of walking. Basically, a lot of the time when people see woodcocks, they'll see the woodcock kind of bobbing their entire body up and down. And then while they're moving forward. So it's very strange. You can look up videos of this if you've never seen it. And but in any case, it looks very funny, and people love to set it to all kinds of music and things like that. But why they actually do this in the wild has been debated. A common explanation for this behavior is that maybe they are kind of generating vibrations to kind of like maybe scare earthworms underground, and in doing so, maybe that helps them detect their prey more easily. But this has been questioned. In fact, other people have pointed out that, first of all, they do this display even in situations where there are no worms to be found, like when they're not walking over a surface where there are likely to be worms. And furthermore, it has also been pointed out that woodcocks only seem to do this kind of strange walk when they've noticed someone observing them, basically. So it seems more likely that this kind of strange behavior is actually something of a kind of warning signal to potential predators, such as a hiker that might be watching them. Basically, it means that, okay, I see you're there, so don't bother coming after me because I'm just going to fly away, and that's a waste of energy for both of us. And so basically, it's a signal that the woodcock uses when you're close enough to make it nervous, but not so close that it wants to take off right away. And that currently seems to be the most plausible explanation for this behavior, but it definitely deserves more study. So yeah, that's a little bit about woodcocks, and a pretty interesting new study that shows that they produce the most brilliant white plumage of all birds, at least among those I've measured so far. And of course, they only study one species of woodcock in this paper, so who knows how the other woodcock species might compare. That's definitely room for future work to explore. Do you have anything to add to the study, or anything about woodcocks in general?
Well, certainly. Two big things that I definitely wanted to note. It is very interesting that the Eurasian woodcock scored higher in reflectance of the white compared to the Caspian tern,
Hmm.
which is kind of funny when you think about it, because like a woodcock, like when people talk about like drab birds, quote unquote,
Right.
like the brown birds, that's like usually up there with them, and yet like its wingtips, oh, excuse
Uh,
me, its tail tips are brighter than a bird which is mostly white.
right. Yeah.
It's like that's a fun situation.
Indeed.
Yeah, it's interesting that there's still some mystery regarding why this is so. Um, Admittedly, like my first thought is like, well, it's a nocturnal bird, and birds do have a different vision compared to mammals, so
Hmm.
they can see a lot more. Maybe it's to make it easier to see during the nighttime.
Hmm.
Um, but I again, that's my um, armchair thoughts.
Hmm.
Honestly, I would have to look more into that. Um, yeah, because like I don't know if we've ever talked about this on the show before, but like regarding nocturnal birds, um, and like given the fact that birds tend to have like much more like color vision, like they can see ultraviolet, um, is that in any way affected by the night hours?
Uh, yes, at least to the extent that that's been studied. For example, I think owls have more restricted color vision than a lot of other birds, for example. Although they might still be UV sensitive, however. But yeah, just the range of colors they can see is reduced. I don't recall off the top of my head if anybody has studied woodcock color vision in particular, so I'm not sure how they compare to like the diurnal species of sandpipers.
That's interesting. Interesting. I thought this was a really neat study. And of course, I do have to chuckle that you mentioned like the one meme. Um, Honestly, like there is like a second woodcock meme,
Hmm.
um, which is kind of funny that like a bird of this sort gets two memes.
Yeah, yeah.
Because they have one where it's like one of the ground calls that you were alluding to,
Hmm.
the
The
peen,
pink,
preen,
yeah.
peen, yeah. Um, Somebody took footage of one of these birds doing that, and it's kind of like doing it in a circle. So
Mm,
like it stands in one direction,
right.
does that noise, then turns as another noise. Somebody took that and they put it to "Shine" by Collective Soul.
Oh.
It's just a funny like they have the bird making the call and then it goes
Hmm.
and
Right, 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 right.
it cuts the grayscale. Whoa! Oh, that always gets me weak every time I see it. That and the friggin' the bobbing walk.
Hmm.
That's oh my gosh. And like I mean, it's a cute bird.
Yeah.
So like it totally owns both cases for sure.
Hmm.
Um, well, I think we'll have to definitely link those two in the description. Because like obviously like with meme culture, like things come and go so quick
Yeah.
that measuring obscurity is all about temporal distance. So for all we know, like this may be just a niche thing on Tumblr or
Right,
something.
right.
It's not as wide as like maybe other memes, for example. But no, like on a more serious note, yeah, that is kind of remarkable that a nocturnal, like forest living bird, has developed such bright tail feathers for seemingly for like for display purposes.
Hmm.
It's surprising. I think and a lot of things in nature are surprising, and you kind of have to expect the unexpected
Hmm.
when it
Yeah.
comes to things like this. So great pick for a story, my friend. Um, but I think it's now time to move on to my second and final story on my end of things. So let's go ahead and do that. And I guess kind of echoing what you said earlier. Oh, an anthropology story about indigenous peoples. It's like, well, that's what I like. So thanks. um, this represents an interesting correction in the history of Amerindian peoples living in and around the Great Plains of North America. So we're definitely shifting environments here. Um, I think it's important to establish some context before we get into the actual paper itself. So, way back in episode 11 of my series, Humanity a Prologue, I only very briefly remarked on the early history of the Great Plains,
Hmm.
how this region was always fairly sparsely populated for the majority of human life on the continent, mainly the domain of nomadic forager groups who made seasonal expeditions into the grasslands to utilize the extensive bison herds that once roamed very widely. The majority of these hunting trips were communal affairs that often stretched for days, with groups of people stalking the herds and driving the animals over a steep cliff or into a sand dune or a swamp depression, and then spearing them with the atlatl or spear thrower. The bow and arrow is a much more recent introduction into the Great
Hmm.
Plains. And it wasn't until about the first century BC that new peoples began to migrate to the eastern half of the Great Plains. So that members of various Siouan and Chidoan speaking groups, these peoples carried cultural traditions stemming from the eastern woodlands Hopewell complex. So for the first time on the Great Plains, people were making pottery and they were constructing communal burial mounds, for example. These groups settled along the Missouri and Paiute rivers, which provided a ready water supply and a more biodiverse plant and animal community to utilize than on the more extensive grasslands to the west. These conditions permitted humans to form sedentary settlements, and in time, horticultural and later agricultural methods began to be implemented. So by around 900 AD, we get the Neolithic Plains village period in the east, in contrast to the sort of epipaleolithic nomadic groups that still persisted in the west. It's from the early Plains village period that the ancestors of nations like the Pawnee, the Mandan, and the Hidatsa trace their roots. And that's pretty much where I left it on episode 11. But there's a much larger and more detailed history as we move further forwards in time. So by the late 1500s AD, for example, more nomadic groups started spreading into the Great Plains, one of which, speaking a Southern Athabascan language, settled in the American Southwest, where some viewers who watched my recent dog episode will recall they introduced a large, hardy breed of dog that was used as a beast of burden for caravanning goods across the plains. And this movement is actually attested by both genetic studies as well as archaeological sites like the Dismal River Complex in Nebraska, which is far away from where the Apachean groups live today. There's also a movement of Shoshonian-speaking peoples in the 1700s AD who branched from groups living in Wyoming and settled across Oklahoma, Texas, and New Mexico, where they became known as the Namuna or Comanche, stars of the recent movie Prey, for example. These are examples of west to east movements into the Great Plains, but there were also east to west movements over the last few centuries. So the settlement of French and English colonists obviously disrupted many of the lives of the Eastern Native Americans. And those who did not succumb to slavery and disease were forced westward out of their lands. And as these groups moved, others ahead of them were sometimes pushed west as well. In one notable example, the Haudenosaunee, or the League of the Iroquois, became so saturated with firearms that people found it much easier to take over already occupied land in and around the Great Lakes region. So hence people like the Osage, Kansas, Omaha, and Missouri were forced to take their boats and ride down the Mississippi and then Missouri rivers to find new homes in areas that would one day be named after them as
Hmm.
U.S. states. And other groups like the Oseti Sakowin, that is the Sioux, experienced their own demographic expansions both long before European settlement and as a result of it, with the aforementioned Haudenosaunee incursions pushing some of their communities west by the 1650s. And this happened so on and so forth. And such was the situation when the domestic horse was introduced by the Spanish colonists in the late 15th century AD. Now, considered by the early American anthropologist Peter Farb as an equestrian revolution, the horse just utterly transformed life on the Great
Hmm.
Plains. And for a relatively brief period of time, human activity there reached levels that were never seen in North America up to that point, almost comparable to the transformation of the Central Asian steppes following their own acquisition of the horse, which is ultimately where the domestic horse originated from. This animal changed and provided essential aid in anything from transportation to warfare, hunting, economics, social status, certainly. And on a personal level, Plains Native Americans came to view the horse with very great reverence. The Lakota Nation recognized horses as belonging to their own nation, Shokawakan, that existed not in a wild or domestic state, but existed alongside humans in a mutual relationship that was built on respect and welfare. So this paper by William Timothy Treel Taylor and colleagues strove to better understand this particular period of time, to ask when specifically did the horse begin to impact life on the Great Plains. Now, the traditional account, which had been pieced together mainly from written European sources, was that the domestic horse, and this is after spreading northward from Mexico, where it was originally deposited, first became a factor on the grasslands following the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. This is when groups of Puebloan peoples, led by a religious leader, Pope, successfully managed to expel the Spanish colonists from their lands for about a 12-year period. And of note here was that one of the strategies used was the stealing of the settlers' horses, so they couldn't escape for reinforcements, and then later taking already abandoned horses from those who were driven away. It was then supposed that it was starting with these particular horses that species spread out in rapid succession across the Great Plains, so that by the mid 1700s, just about every nation there had their own horses. Well, the paper concerned here today has found evidence to the contrary. There are a number of archaeological sites from historic periods that contain horses in a Native American context, and the team found that many of these horse remains recovered preserved evidence on their skeletons for the use of both bridling and riding, and that includes telltale marks for these activities on their jaws and around their skulls. These remains were also given isotopic analysis that showed that they were being foddered with domestic crops like maize, which is one of the staples of the North American agricultural products. And the team was also able to sequence DNA from these horses, which essentially confirmed that the majority of them did descend from Spanish sources, as the written record showed. The leftovers were those that came from later introductions by the English, which would overtake much of their gene pool. But the important thing to note is that the horses are all European. The team did test to see if there were any gene flow from pre-Columbian horses. And this is because a couple fringe groups, as well as some indigenous nations, have argued that horses have been on the continent with them since the very beginning, thus implying that horses survived the megafaunal extinctions of the Pleistocene. But again, this is not a result that the majority of researchers working on the subject consider. But it wouldn't hurt to check at least. Of course, lo and behold, they found none. So all this is to say that we have multiple data points converging to show that these archaeological sites do indeed contain horses descended from European imports. And so the only data point left that was absolutely necessary for this study was to radiocarbon date them, to find out how old these horse remains actually were. And it was here that the authors found this new evidence, showing that the dispersal of horses into the Great Plains occurred at a much older point in time than the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. In fact, it's something on the order of almost 100 years earlier than that. Native Americans seem to have begun to acquire horses in this part of the world by the 1590s, as attested by their presence at some sites like Paco Pueblo in New Mexico, where isolated skeletal elements had been found. And then, in a rather rapid succession, people here began to trade horses as far as Idaho and Kansas and Wyoming, so that by 1640, and you can see the little tiny map here on the bottom right, horses were being widely used across the region, with evidence that they were already being incorporated into ritual and ceremonial use by this time, as well as being used for mounted riding. Now, written sources come in to help us understand that Native Americans did observe the Spanish colonists and learned how to train and ride horses for themselves, as the settlers did prohibit the sale of horses to native peoples. But the presence of such horses so far away from European settlements does make it very apparent that despite the foreign intervention in bringing the animals to begin with, this entire cultural transformation was facilitated by the Great Plains peoples themselves on their own terms. In fact, in an article covering the study, a Comanche tribal member and a co-author of this paper, Jimmy Arterbury, put it rather bluntly. Quote, "We have always known and said that we came across horses before we came across the Spanish." End quote. Thus, for at least a period of 2 centuries, the peoples of this region experienced a radical cultural shift towards nomadic mounted horse riding, so powerful in so many ways that even peoples of different language superfamilies were more alike than different. And now that we know that this transformation began much earlier, so our understanding of later Native American settlements on the Great Plains changes. For example, regarding what I earlier described about the Comanche migration, it was originally thought that it was because they acquired horses that these peoples moved from their homelands to the south. But now it seems that the ancestral Comanche were already very well equipped with the knowledge of horse rearing and riding prior to doing so. And in the case for future research, there may even be a possibility that this early northward dispersal may have spread much further north, like into Canada, than had previously been suspected. So obviously this is very exciting research, but what I think makes it even more exciting is the fact that this is a very beautiful example of the sort of cross-cultural, community participating, multidisciplinary work that archaeologists and other scientists, at least Western scientists, should conduct. The team behind this paper included the full participation of several Native American nations, like the Pawnee, Comanche, and Lakota, and in the latter case, the genetic data from and traditional knowledge of their horses was acquired under the proper protocols that provide protection to the Shokakokan. There's a list of 80 citations, which properly credits many Native American historians and scientists who were co-authors on this paper. And it was actually the initiation of Lakota scholars that brought this entire study to fruition in the first place, which was in part inspired to help repair some of the damage and mistrust that had been in place between indigenous peoples and Western scientists for centuries. And so this is something I'm sure the majority of decent people would want to see and see more of.
Mm-hmm.
And I, for one, am very glad to see this paper lead in that direction. So that's kind of what I had to say about this. Albert, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, this is an incredibly cool study. Um, I haven't followed the debate about the dispersal of horses in North America that much, but I've seen enough to know that it can get pretty heated. Granted, that is in part because of the existence of aforementioned fringe groups. But definitely, I do know it's a subject of immense discourse. And to see a study that clarifies the topic so much is definitely really gratifying. But like you said, I think even more so is the fact that this is such a great example of interdisciplinary work that involves local communities who the study is about or involves. I think all aspects of the study, from what I can tell from a non-expert standpoint, seem really incredible and a real model of what scientific research should be like.
Oh yeah, for sure. And yeah, definitely, I will comment on what you mentioned regarding the fringe groups. It is one of those things that I have seen around. Like on my Twitter feed, like it'll pop up like once a year,
Mm-hmm.
this discourse, and then it'll kind of just peter out and then come back, like so many things do.
Right.
Um, and it does seem that a good chunk of, I don't know if this is the right word, but a good chunk of fodder for this discourse is the fact that apparently there is, I believe, environmental DNA of horses
Hmm.
in North America at the latest 5,000 years, 6 to 5,000 years old. Um, and it's been argued thus that like in the grand scheme of things, that's not a long period of
Hmm.
time in terms of certain oral traditions that people can have around the world. Like
Right.
look at Australia, for example. So therefore, it's argued that oh well, where these horses are and where these people have been, they've kept on to the memory of those horses and thus retained an understanding of those horses to such a point that when the horses were introduced by the Spanish, like it was almost second nature that oh, horses, great, we know these guys. We'll take it from here. Um, but again, like that would require a lot of historical hoops to jump through, much less the fact that you essentially would have competing oral traditions and like indigenous knowledge with each other.
Hmm.
Because for example, like according to the historical record, horses were deposited in Mexico first, where the after Columbus and friends settled in the Caribbean and brought horses there, then horses were brought into Mexico following like Cortez's missions, for example. Um, all the indigenous peoples like in the Valley of Mexico, like where the Aztec Triple Alliance was, they couldn't make heads or tails of horses. They thought either that they were big deer or that the horses and their mounted riders were like centaur type figures, some sort of unholy abomination that was attacking them. So clearly, like horses were something new for them, uh, in contrast to what has been proposed for groups further north, where the horse is supposed to have been there from the beginning. So, I mean, obviously, like when it comes to fringe hypotheses, like I have to put on my skeptic glasses um, and address these things as best as I am able to like look them up. Um, but there is always like a very tiny like um, like benefit of the doubt, I suppose, um, in like if there is something reasonable here, like obviously like it doesn't necessarily have to mean that like the fully developed complex relationship with horses and their uses as documented by Europeans on the Great Plains was in place 5,000 years ago. Um, but certainly some sort of like small component of that, if it does turn out that horses were somehow spared from the megafaunal extinctions. But no, honestly, like uh, hearing researchers' comments on this discourse, that does not seem likely at all. Horses, as far as we can tell right now, with the best evidence that we have, and in complete fairness, um, that's something new. Europeans brought that in. Horses, even if there were some stragglers towards the end, as there almost certainly would have been regarding other megafauna like sloths and bison, for example, they were not a presence in North America for much of the later periods of human history. So that's my take on that. I don't know if we'll get angry comments or at least curious comments like following this episode's release, but I mean, we reserve that right of our viewers to do so, and we will respond in kind. So that is all I will say on that. Albert, I believe we have your study, and then we're good to go.
Sounds good. So, yes, our final study for this episode, and my second study that I picked, is not about birds, but it is still about animal coloration. So I kind of did deliberately choose these studies to go together because of that shared theme. And this one is also, I think, certainly a very interesting one. Now, this one is not about birds, but it is about amphibians. And specifically, the evolution of warning coloration in amphibians. So, a lot of amphibians, as you might know, are poisonous. And in biology, there is often a distinction drawn between things that are poisonous and things that are venomous. As the cliche goes, if you eat it and you die, uh, then that thing is poisonous. So poisonous things are basically toxic when they are ingested. But if something bites you and you die, that makes it venomous, assuming that what kills you is a toxin. So venom is usually defined as being toxin that is injected through, often fangs, but they can be spines and other ways of doing that injection. Now there are a lot of amphibians, a lot of like frogs and salamanders, for example, that are poisonous, and this is a very important defense mechanism for these animals. In recent years, it has been found that there actually are a few amphibians that are venomous, but compared to poisonous species, they're not that common. And it is technically possible for an animal to be both venomous and poisonous, although that is also relatively rare. But in any case, poison is a very, very common adaptation in amphibians. It's a very common way for them to protect themselves from predators. And that probably makes a lot of sense because these animals are, for most part, pretty squishy. They have very thin skin that is kind of quite wet and delicate, easily injured. So if they want some way of protecting themselves, poison is a pretty good one if they want to discourage other animals from eating them. Now, a lot of these poisonous amphibians have very bright colors to warn predators that they are poisonous. And so the predator doesn't have to bite them first and potentially kill them or at least fatally injure them before they get the message. They can just say, okay, yep, that's a poisonous thing. I'm not going to touch it. And then both of them can go on living their lives. And you might be familiar with this, most famously in the poison dart frogs, which are well named. A lot of poison dart frogs come in all kinds of amazing bright colors that advertise the fact that they are poisonous, and there are plenty of other amphibian species that do similar things. But the evolution of warning coloration in toxic animals, especially in something that is otherwise physically so unprotected like most amphibians, presents a bit of a paradox. Because you think about it, so a classic amphibian that is not poisonous, or at least not poisonous enough to be very dangerous to a potential predator. And I might add here that some poisonous amphibians are among the most poisonous animals in terms of the strength of their toxin that we know about. So definitely in this group we see this adaptation taken to a real extreme, and that's I believe the current record holder is considered to be the golden poison dart frog, which has the scientific name Philobaites terribilis, which is named after how poisonous it is. But in any case, if you think about an amphibian that is not that poisonous yet, well, most amphibians that aren't that poisonous, instead of having very bright colors, usually have colors that help them blend into their environments. So they're usually well camouflaged. So oftentimes there'll be shades of green or brown, and of course we often associate frogs with the color green. So how do you get to a point where they evolve these bright color patterns all over themselves, making them more visible to predators, and yet these brightly colored mutants aren't immediately killed off by predators by being seen? Because even if they have already evolved the poison, how do the predators know that these bright colors mean that they're dangerous? The predators often need to learn these things. They're not innate. And so even if something is poisonous, but it suddenly evolves like this bright coloration from a cryptically colored ancestor, it's quite possible that these bright color variants will all be quickly killed off by being bitten by predators, even if the predator doesn't eat them afterward because they taste bad from the poison. So how do we get all this kind of rainbow of bright colors in amphibians anyway, if this would seem to be what would normally happen? And so to understand this paradox better, the authors of this new study decided to kind of categorize the color patterns of modern amphibians into 5 different categories. And I keep saying like amphibians as a group here, but they mostly look at frogs and salamanders. So they did not consider caecilians, which are a group of obscure legless amphibians that we talked about a few news episodes ago. So you can go back and check that out if you want to learn more about caecilians. But they looked at frogs and salamanders, and by the way, if you're not aware, toads are a type of frog, and newts are a type of salamander, phylogenetically speaking. So they're covered in those categories. But in any case, they classified the color patterns of modern amphibians into 5 categories. So cryptic, so basically meaning your typical camouflage colors. Conspicuous, so bright colors all over the body, as you see in many poison dart frogs. And then they also included a few other categories, because it turns out that some amphibians are not entirely cryptic or entirely conspicuous, but somewhere in between. So they can be what they call partially ventrally conspicuous. Now, ventral refers to basically the towards the bottom of something, so towards the belly of an animal. So some amphibians have bright colors, like, for example, underneath their limbs, but these are normally not visible. They actually have to expose the underside of their limbs for you to see these bright colors. Otherwise, they might be cryptically colored on the rest of their bodies. And so they called this kind of color pattern partially ventrally conspicuous. And they also had another category called fully ventrally conspicuous. So in species that have this kind of color pattern, the entire underside of the body, like the belly and the throat and often the undersides of the limbs, might all be covered in some kind of bright color pattern, but the back, for example, might still be cryptically colored. And this is actually the kind of color pattern we're seeing on the image here. So this is a picture of an oriental fire-bellied toad, one of several species of fire-bellied toads. If you're not quite sure what is going on here, you're seeing this frog from the side, and the head is pointing towards the left, and its rear end is pointing towards the right. And what it has done is that it is actually in a bit of a threat display, essentially. It has closed its eyes, and it's raised its all 4 of its limbs up above its back. So it's basically exposing the underside, or basically the palms and its soles, towards the outside. So something looking at it can easily see that it's got these bright orange color patterns on the undersides of its limbs. And in addition to these bright color patterns on the limbs, these toads are called fire-bellied toads because the entire underside of their body is also covered in this kind of bright coloration. In some species it's yellow, in some species it's orange. It can vary. But in any case, they only expose this bright color when they're feeling threatened. Otherwise, you can see that the top surface of the body is mostly this kind of mottled green and black colorations. And as you can see, this allows them to blend in really well with the types of surroundings they like to be in. So right here, it's sitting on a patch of moss. And normally, if it weren't for these orange color patterns that it's exposing willingly, it would be very well hidden against this moss. But when it feels threatened, when it's been seen by a predator, they will expose these bright color patterns and say, hey, I am poisonous, so don't try eating me. And so there are some of these amphibians that are partially ventrally conspicuous or fully ventrally conspicuous. And then finally, a 5th category that the authors used was polymorphic. And this basically means that members of the same species can have different types of color patterns. So some of them might be cryptic, and some of them might be conspicuous. And so after dividing up modern amphibian colors into these 5 categories, they decided to map the distribution of these characters, of these color patterns, across a phylogeny of amphibians, so across a family tree of amphibians, and then see what were the most likely kind of transitions between these different types of color patterns. So are you likely to be able to evolve from a cryptic color pattern directly to a conspicuous one? Or do you have to go through some intermediate steps? Or what? Like, what kind of patterns can you find when you look at the evolution of these color patterns across the family tree? And so after testing a lot of alternative models, they found that the best supported model for the distribution of color patterns in amphibians suggested that probably ancestrally modern amphibians were well camouflaged animals that did not have bright color patterns, which is not a huge surprise for reasons we stated earlier. Camouflage is one of the most straightforward types of defense that there is, and unless you have some kind of other way of defending yourself, like a very strong poison, then most animals tend to be pretty cryptic by default in terms of their coloration. However, they did confirm that it is very difficult to evolve directly from a completely cryptic color state to a completely conspicuous color state, and that is very likely for the reasons we mentioned before, because something that is suddenly conspicuous in the middle of a cryptic population is going to get quickly picked off by a predator, especially if they haven't learned that those bright colors might be a warning signal. And this may not be true for all animals, but it certainly is true for amphibians, according to this study. Some animals, like beetles, for example, have hard shells that might make them less vulnerable to predators, and so animals like that might be able to survive an initial contact with a predator. At least more frequently than something like an amphibian can. But for amphibians, it seems that it's very difficult to go from cryptic directly to completely conspicuous. Instead, it was much more likely for conspicuous coloration to evolve from something with a fully ventrally conspicuous color pattern. And furthermore, it was most common for something with a fully ventrally conspicuous color pattern to evolve from something with a partially ventrally conspicuous color pattern. So you get this transition of steps. And now it is not only possible to evolve to conspicuous coloration from a fully ventrally conspicuous state. They found that it is also possible to go from evolve into a conspicuous color pattern from a partially ventrally conspicuous state or a polymorphic state. But the most common and the most likely type of transition would be from something that is already ventrally conspicuous. And that actually makes a lot of sense, because a ventrally conspicuous color pattern is a color pattern that these amphibians only show at the point where they have already been spotted by a predator. So at that point, the camouflage is not doing them any good anymore, and so they kind of switch strategies, right? And so in that case, a lot of the time, yes, these color patterns are warning signals, so they are warning that these amphibians are toxic. And so it is easier to evolve these color signals in the first place if you're already toxic. But there can also be other benefits to having these kind of hidden color signals as well. And one is that they suddenly make you look very strange looking, and a lot of predators tend to be pretty wary of things that are pretty strange looking. It's like, what is this? I don't know if it's dangerous, so maybe I'm not going to touch it. Especially if it's something that looked very different just moments ago. And another type is what is called flash coloration, and that is when normally, of course, in a normal state, these amphibians are camouflaged, but if they're scared, they might suddenly leap up to it or leap over to a different direction, and in that instant when they leap, you might be able to catch a glimpse of those bright color patterns that they have, but as soon as they've landed elsewhere, those color patterns disappear, and that makes it very difficult for a predator to locate where the amphibian has gone off to, because they suddenly see this bright flash of color, and then, oops, suddenly your search image is completely different, and then in that way, the amphibian can potentially avoid predation as well. So originally, amphibians evolved kind of these hidden color patterns, perhaps for all kinds of reasons, many of them related to defense. And then from there, probably predators might learn that, oh, okay, so these color patterns mean that this thing doesn't taste good. And then clearly, this kind of color pattern would have an advantage over a cryptically colored one, at least if you're already dangerous to eat. And from there, since predators already know that these color patterns mean danger, it is much easier to evolve a completely conspicuous color pattern that does not put you at much higher risk of being killed. So that's the idea there. But the final point that I'll highlight here is that the authors found that polymorphism, where an individual species has multiple different types of color patterns, either cryptic or conspicuous or what have you, at least in amphibians, is very unstable, so it is not something that's likely to last in a population for very long. Instead, it is much more likely for polymorphic species to quickly evolve into either a completely cryptic or completely conspicuous state. So that is pretty interesting. It seems to be an unstable kind of state in amphibians, even though some modern species do exhibit it. So it seems like for amphibians, kind of completely devoting to a cryptic state or a cryptic state or a conspicuous state is a much more stable kind of strategy in terms of how well it works out for them. But in any case, this is a really fascinating study. I mean, animal coloration is a really fascinating field of study in general. Like, why are animals all these different colors, right? That's a really interesting question to investigate. But also, it also seems to solve the paradox of how conspicuously colored amphibians evolve in the first place. And it turns out that's very likely that in most cases they kind of transition from this fully ventrally conspicuous state. And that would seem to answer the question of how do conspicuous mutants survive long enough to be selected. So, I think that's pretty much all I have to say on this study. Do you have anything else to add?
Well, certainly, like the format of this study, where you're looking at the evolution of a behavior and you use phylogeny to kind of understand how it could have developed.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I love that, and it definitely reminds me of one of our earlier episodes where I talked about a paper that did the same thing, but with the broken wing display.
Oh, that's true. Yeah.
Um, and so like, it's kind of cool to see that applied in other places, including here. Um, yeah, definitely the conclusions make more sense to me. Not to be too comical, but it does feel kind of unrealistic to like say have a population of frogs and then in one generation you get a couple individuals that just pop and they're like bright yellow or
Right.
red. Um, and it's like, I mean, those because if the whole thing about like a predator has to like, you know, eat a new food source to begin with to know that it's poisonous or and harmful,
Right.
well then like that first generation of frogs would probably be stamped out quickly because like
Right.
they'd all be eaten and they'd all be venomous and well they'd all be poisonous and it's like oh well okay
Right.
gotta kind of start over the
Yeah.
next time around. Um, so it definitely does make more sense that a sort of transitional process of only having one part of the body have this sort of conspicuous coloration and then just over time either get lost or spread uh, throughout the body as a whole, like in some of the poison dart frogs
Mm-hmm.
or poison arrow frogs. Like that tracks, I would think. Um, but it's interesting to hear about the polymorphism result.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So while maybe this is asking a lot because I know like we're not necessarily amphibian experts, but like do you know any examples of like polymorphic poisonous frogs and salamanders? I'm trying to see if I can
Ooh.
think of any examples.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Honestly, I would probably have to like go into their data set to be able to give you any examples because yeah, off the top of my head, I am not sure which ones they looked at.
Hmm. I guess it kind of goes to show like how unstable it is. Then
Right,
you
right.
can't
Yeah, exactly.
give any example. I imagine it's probably because I would have to look at the paper too, but I imagine like that was probably like the least common
I
category
think so.
out
Yeah.
of the five that they found. Because yeah, like the vengefully conspicuous, like this firebelly toad, like oh yeah,
Right.
like that's I'm very familiar with
Right.
that. Um, uh, that's interesting to think about. As a defense mechanism, like the threat of poison. Because like many different amphibians, like even like the non-poisonous ones,
Mm-hmm.
they have a lot of similar, like very vivid, dynamic ways of saying "Don't eat me"
Right.
or "You're gonna get it."
Yeah.
Um, I cannot remember the species, but there's a frog where it has like little bumps on its
That's
hindquarters
right. Yeah.
that look like these big eyes,
Yeah.
and like it'll puff itself up to look like a big head.
Right.
And so, like
Yeah.
any snakes or things that want to come and eat it will be faced with just this impossibly huge thing and be like, "Nope, pass."
Yep.
And then the frog gets to live.
Yep.
Um, incredibly creative for sure. And that's interesting too because I know, like, for lack of a better word, regular toads
Yeah.
do that too without needing to have weird eye spots and
That's
stuff.
true. Yeah.
Like the European toad, and I'm sure there are others as well, will like puff itself up,
Right.
like do like a big like push up, inflate itself a little bit and just be like, I'm too big, I'm too big. And
Yeah.
usually that works. So like
Right.
I can see that turning into one of these things with eye spots
Mhm.
and then it just kind of sticking because it's very effective.
Right. Right.
Uh, so a lot of organisms use the eye spot defense. I know
Yes.
butterflies and moths, some of them do it
Hmm.
to decent effect. Um, but no, like that's just kind of a roundabout way of saying it's a fascinating result, and obviously, it would be nice if we had better like skin impressions and remains of fossil amphibians that we could
Right.
plug into something like this to kind of confirm or deny like this sort of model.
Absolutely.
Because like certainly I can see a tiny conflict where you are looking at already like contemporaneous organisms altogether. Um, that might give an impression of a result,
Yeah.
but
Absolutely.
like I think it's fair. I think it's fair what they did,
Hmm.
because certainly like the some of these amphibian groups have probably rapidly evolved over the last few million years, so
Hmm.
they probably hold on to those earlier blueprints to the present day
Right.
that would have been had they looked back then. Um, so no, definitely, I think this is an extraordinary paper,
Hmm.
another great example of like what can phylogeny do for research
Yep.
besides just telling you how organisms are related to each other.
Yeah.
I definitely appreciate that. Um, well, hey, unless there's anything else you wanted to close off with, that is it
Yep.
for our episode. Um, Definitely want to thank you all for joining us today and sharing these wildly diverse stories that we love to share and disseminate so much. Let's move on to our final closing material. So we are on Patreon. We are patreon.com/time and clades. Even if you have just $1, you are more than welcome to come and donate. We will always appreciate that, and your contributions will help us continue this series and develop new projects and expansions. Um, we have been playing with our Patreon model a little bit in recent times, so we'll go ahead and mention this now since we've kind of made it official. Some of our patrons may notice that we've started to make special previews for upcoming news episodes because these do take time to make. Um, and so we kind of have the material that we want to talk about already set ahead of time. So what we've been doing is like if you're in one of our highest tiers, that is the Phanerozoic tier, you will get to see what we're going to talk about in upcoming episodes and kind of get a sneak preview about like what topics we'll cover and like what kind of shout outs we're going to give. So if you're really interested in that, well, then maybe consider bumping up the tier. But that's completely up to y'all.
Yep.
And any contributions, of course, we greatly appreciate and we value. We currently have 4 patrons that are in the tier where they get to be shouted out for each episode. So we want to definitely give a shout out and thanks to our patrons Paul, Denver, Frankish, and Val Denunzio. So we thank you all very much for your support. Moving on to our other acknowledgments. Of course, we want to thank our dear good friends Henry and Alicia for their contributions to the series. Henry provided the wonderfully jazzy theme music that opens up each episode, and Alicia is responsible for the color scheme of Albert's Alvarezor avatar, which is so iconic and nice. Of course, we are on Twitter, where we usually update by uploading new episodes whenever they air and sharing them around. So we are at Time and Clades. But most likely you are checking us out on our YouTube page through Time and Clades. So if you want to like and subscribe, always appreciate it too. If you have any questions for us regarding the material we covered in this episode, or just in general, or earlier episodes, you can comment on our YouTube page, you can send us a tweet, or you can send us to our email, timeandclades@gmail.com. Um, it definitely seems like the YouTube comment section is probably the most popular option for our viewers, new and old, to either send questions or make very nice comments. We always appreciate receiving those, and we do read every one and try to respond in kind where appropriate. So rest assured, if you do send a question to us, we will almost certainly get it. Maybe not immediately afterwards, but we will get it. We promise. And of course, if you want to read any of the papers we talked about today, or check out the links to things that we have mentioned, like the aforementioned woodcock memes, or the Perry and Carney comic, or the Prehistoric Planet 2 announcements. We will drop all of those in the description, where you can go check those out, as we do for every episode that we release. And with that, that is the end of our episode officially. Um, now, what's next? Well, of course, we will keep doing news episodes
Hmm.
when we can. But we've been chatting, and we think it's time for our next review episode.
Hmm.
And when you know it, it will be our second movie review episode.
Hmm.
Um, do we dare hint what it is, or do we keep it a surprise for when it comes?
Well, that's a good question. Well, I will say it is a relatively recent movie. Came out within the last decade, and it is related to topics that we usually discuss on the show. I'll be very impressed with anyone who manages to guess it. So, well, I'll leave you with that.
Sure, that sounds good. And of course, chances are, like our patrons will probably get that first. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But okay, awesome. Thank you all so much again, and we hope you have a wonderful day.
Indeed. Take care.